Hello and welcome to Stork'd, the podcast, in which we explore the many ways to build and define family. This is your host, Julia, and today I'm so excited to introduce you to Keegan Prue, who is the author of the IVF Dad. It is a book that journals he and his wife, Olivia's journey through fertility through IVF, as well as gives you some exercises on how to think about your own journey. So he's got a multi-layered approach in this book. And I have to tell you, even though I am neither a dad nor did I go through IVF, I went through IUI, which is a lighter form of fertility treatment. I love this book and cannot recommend it enough. I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that are going on in the general world right now and how they relate to Keegan and to Keegan's episode. And permit me, because there's some big picture macro trends that I see going on that I think are really important. The first is that the men are so silent when it comes to talking about fertility journeys. Where are you guys? Where are your voices? Come on, let's be heard. I, as a podcaster, have a very hard time getting male voices on this podcast. I also have a hard time finding them in places like social media and blogs and other places where you see the women talking about fertility treatments and talking about adoption journeys and talking about choosing whether or not to have kids. Women are so present in the fertility spaces and men, quiet. Here's my thesis. There is this movement in family management. It's most characterized by the book called Fair Play. And there's a lot of research that suggests that even in a dual income house, one partner, and in a heterosexual couple, it's often the female partner, takes on the extra burden. So she's working a full-time job, but she's also managing the household, managing getting groceries in, making sure it's clean, managing kids' schedules like play dates, whether or not they have a birthday gift to bring to the birthday party, whether or not they've been signed up for summer camp, bedtime routines, all that stuff. So it's 2 full-time jobs. And there's a movement to kind of rebalance and make more equitable our relationships. And I think that Keegan and his wife are doing that with the IVF Dad. They're making the fertility journey conversation more equitable because it starts with preconception. It starts with who's booking all the appointments with the doctor, whose body is going through the significant changes and the hormones and the injections, who's going through the surgeries, who's carrying the baby. But it doesn't have to be that just because your body is doing more, that you are doing more of the heavy lifting. And what I love about Keegan is that he is an equal participant with his wife in some of the major decision making. And his book and this episode and a tool that we came up with together lay out questions that you can ask, ways that you can navigate the decision-making and the emotional toll that fertility journeys take on a couple. It's really special. So, as you can see, I love this episode. I love Keegan. I love the book. And the reason is because I think that by tackling the topic of infertility through the male perspective, Keegan is also tackling inequitable relationships insofar as they play out in fertility journeys. If you love it as much as I do, don't forget to share it with a friend. Please review Stork'd wherever you listen to podcasts and sign up for our newsletter. I think it's pretty awesome. Here's Keegan.
Welcome, Keegan. I am so excited to have you on Stork'd, the podcast in which we explore the many ways to build and define family. And you and your wife have a really amazing story, which has led to an incredible book and resource for all of us. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and we'll dive into your journey to what brought you here, but tell us about who you are personally, professionally, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, my name is Keegan Prue. I grew up in the far reaches of upstate New York in the Adirondacks. And so, grew up in a small town. I feel like my upbringing was probably more like what you'd see in, the 50s sitcom than maybe like more modern life, but in a really cool way, right? Like a town where we just hopped on our bikes and like rode out to the water hole or like went and played soccer in the streets and stuff like that. So it was a very cool place to grow up. But, when it came time to kind of go out in the world, it was also a very small and kind of limited viewpoint. So yeah, I went out from there and went to school in Finger Lakes and then spent some time in Boston and eventually landed in New York City, where I started my professional life. On the professional side, I work in education. I was a teacher at a charter school, taught elementary school, and eventually became a special education leader and generally just a school leader there. So have always been really passionate about education, just the potential of education. Certainly for me, the education that I got and the education that my parents always put such a premium on helped me do everything I've been able to do and gave me so many opportunities. So I think that's why I kind of ended up in the education space. So I feel like I kind of bring the lens of a teacher to a lot of things I do, which is probably how I ended up writing a book. But so that's kind of the professional side. And then also, along the way in New York City, met my wonderful wife, Olivia, through the good old modern connections of OkCupid. So we were really fortunate to find each other. Anybody who's dated these days, and certainly in a big city, knows what a crapshoot it can be. We always say we both had to kiss a lot of frogs to find each other, but we're very fortunate to get there. And so, we met each other, and very quickly, we were both around 30 at the time. So we're at that point where we were ready to move on and plan our life together.
And that brings us to now. Yeah.
Yeah. And that brings us to now, more or less. So, And then on sort of the more fun side of things, me and Olivia really love to cook. I would say like cooking, eating, baking, all of that is a big passion. We try to do as much of that as possible and find good food to make and eat and travel and enjoy. And so.
Oh my gosh.
That's a nutshell.
I'm inviting myself to your house. That sounds amazing.
Oh gosh, anytime. Yeah. Our New Year's Eve parties are legendary. There's always just a massive spread, and all of our friends are good cooks too. So life pro tip, find people who like to cook.
Now, I love that you talk about this from the lens of an educator, because it may seem like a little bit of a left turn or something slightly different from your passions and your everyday work to have written a book that is a guide and a resource and a tool for everyone who's going through fertility treatment. It's called the IVF Dad. And yet, isn't it perfect that as an educator, you can see one more lens through which to educate people using your own experiences?
Yeah, it is. And I mean, anybody, of course, who's been through any sort of family building journey knows there's just a lot to know. There's a lot of medical terms. If you're diving into the IUI, IVF kind of fertility treatment route, there's just a ton of information to know about what might be causing any issues, what different treatments are out there. And definitely, I think that was an inspiration was, I kind of just took the dive in when we realized that we were not being successful in trying to get pregnant the old fashioned way, but it was a lot. And certainly in our different turns where we looked at adoption, fostering, many options to build our family, there's always a lot to learn. And so, I guess I was probably inspired to make a resource that helps kind of distill all of that information down.
Well, I definitely want to talk a lot about the resource and the creation of it. But let's walk through that journey that you've hinted at a couple of times. You've met your wife now on OkCupid, and I would imagine that you're thinking about your 1950s experience in upstate New York and saying, this is what's going to happen for me too. Tell us what happens from there.
Oh, totally. Yeah, that's exactly it. Me and Olivia at the time were living in Brooklyn. We lived right next to Prospect Park. So we would go walking and talk about that life we envisioned and the family we envisioned and all of that stuff. I always say we basically hatched our plans to escape the city and move upstate to get a house and a yard and a dog and kids, and got through the first 3 steps and then totally slammed into the brick wall. But that was really what we envisioned for ourselves. We wanted to move out of the city. It was a great place to spend our 20s. Very thankful for that time and everything that it showed us. We were ready for some more space. And like you said, the house and the yard and the dog and all of that. And so we decided to start trying for kids just about the time that we moved out of the city. We'd gotten married and we felt like we're working our plan. And so did that. 6 months kind of passed quickly by as we moved and bought our house and all of that. And, we ended up after that 6 months kind of hitting just a low point of that first realization of maybe something is not working the way it should be here. And that was hard because we definitely had that, kind of found that quick, successful feeling of we've achieved these goals of being able to move and get a wonderful house and all these things. And our dog, Desmond, who is a key player in all of this, of course.
And it's interesting too, right? Because you're glossing over these things, moving, buying a house, getting a dog, as though they're just boom, 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 easy, easy, easy.
Yeah.
And you're articulating this trajectory that's like, done, 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 found my person, found my house. For many of us, myself included, even those steps can be challenging.
Oh, sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And here you are. I mean, things just look like they're coming together in the way that you hoped.
They do. And of course, it's probably easy in some sense to look back and now articulate it in a way that sounds boom, boom, boom. Of course, there were ups and downs along the way. Like I said, there was years of dating that did not lead to the ones that of course, all of that looks easy in retrospect. But yeah, that's a very good point that as we look back on the easy things, and when I actually, go back and unpack all of those things, they're not quite as like linear step by step as it sounds. But of course, given that the last kind of 5 years have been just a family building journey, maybe all those things look a little easier in retrospect. But yeah, so we'd gotten to that point and, hit a point 6 or 7 months into trying to build our family the old fashioned way, where we both kind of, or I think both were feeling, something does not seem to be working. We had read the typical guidance that says, give it a year of trying. If you're, I think under 35 was maybe what we read at the time. But we were already getting to the point where it felt both difficult and it was starting to, I think, weigh on both of us a lot. And the point where we kind of really had that first discussion of what's going on was, we had an instance where Olivia's period was a few days late, 3 or 4 days, but we kind of started to have that building excitement and anticipation of maybe this is the time. Maybe we get to pull out those pregnancy tests that we bought months ago and stuffed in the back of a drawer. But it was a cold, miserable January upstate New York afternoon. And I just remember being sort of doing some chores as one does on Sunday afternoon. And Olivia calling down the hall to me and saying my period came. And, we both kind of just sank. And later that afternoon, we went on a long walk and just kind of had that first discussion of, how are you feeling about how things are going? And obviously we were both concerned. It led us to decide that we needed to be proactive. We needed to start learning more about what we might need to do, what steps we might need to take to be proactive. And so kind of...
You're putting that educator hat back on, right? You're diving into the research. I really want to talk about the proactiveness, but I want to sit for a second. You've used some really interesting descriptors. And if you don't mind, I'd like to press on them just a little bit. You've talked about hitting a brick wall. You've talked about that feeling of sinking and this sense of intuition that something wasn't quite right. Those are, if I'm going to be honest, those are phrases and terminology I usually hear from the women that I interview and less so from the men. Were you both feeling this sense of concern equally? Who brought up the initial conversation? Was it Olivia or was it you?
Olivia was definitely the one who kind of pressed and brought up the original conversation. I give her a lot of credit because she's really just a great conversationalist, I always say. I call her, and I think her family calls her too, Barbara Walters, because she's just got she will meet anybody and will have their life story in 20 minutes. She's met members of my family I've known for my entire life, and she'll find out facts about them in a 15-minute conversation that I never knew. So she's great at sort of making anyone feel comfortable, I think, but was good for me too, because I think I certainly struggled and write about this in the book and have had so many conversations with men about just the kind of stereotype that it's not okay for men to open up, show they're struggling. And so that has always been something a little harder for me. And so when we went on that walk, I think Olivia just started with a couple of open-ended questions of how do you feel about going on right now with this journey to try and get pregnant? And that kind of opened up that conversation to start talking through that disappointment that I definitely was feeling, and that we were both feeling, of the expectation that we had in our head really kind of being shattered because we, as is kind of typical, got the good old American sex education where we're only taught about the 52 ways that we need to prevent getting pregnant, but had no real understanding or education of all the things that have to line up to get pregnant, nor certainly what might happen or what options are available for treatment if you're in those shoes. And so we were both definitely feeling very disappointed, feeling very stressed at that point, and feeling like we needed to take action, because it certainly was just that, whether it was intuition or just that sort of flipping of our expectations, I think we kind of knew at that point, we need to try something different because we can't just go on.
Let's talk now about what you did next. What were the action steps? You're feeling this brick wall. I love that analogy. You've hit that wall. What's your process? What do you do?
Yeah. So first, definitely started with a lot of research, again, back into the education, listened to less podcasts, read blogs, all this stuff, just to get a sense of what are the possibilities here? Because my kind of knowledge and our knowledge of infertility, fertility treatments was very low. So just started there and kind of found out, here's what a reproductive endocrinologist is. And so we kind of quickly moved on to booking all of the types of tests and kind of checkups that we both needed just to kind of get a general sense of like, how is our fertility health? Is there anything we should be concerned about? So Olivia booked in with her OB to do some hormone tests and ultrasounds to kind of check things out. I got my semen analysis. And so over the next couple of months, that kind of gave us a basic understanding of what was going on. And simultaneous to all that, we also researched fertility clinics in our area and booked a consult with them, which was sort of, as is kind of typical with specialists, booked out quite a bit, maybe 4 or 5 months later. But did all that kind of simultaneously just to first kind of see like what's going on with these typical tests through the OB and my semen analysis, but then to also kind of have that backstop of like, let's be proactive about booking a consult with the fertility clinic. Fingers crossed, of course, hope that we wouldn't need it. But spoiler alert, we did. So that was kind of where we went from there.
Okay, so I'm just going to reiterate some of the things I heard because I think it's really important. If anyone is listening right now and is facing that moment, that brick wall moment that you just described, the resources that you shared as being available are podcasts, this one, but others that specifically focus on infertility. There's books like your book, which is going to be a really important resource for any guy who is going through this, and clinics, medical professionals who can guide you through the process. When you got to the clinic and you did your semen analysis and Olivia got tested, what was some of the information they gave you about next steps?
Yeah, so this was sort of an interesting point. In doing all of the initial testing with Olivia's regular OB and my semen analysis, basically what we were told was everything looks okay. There's no real obvious reason that we can tell that anything shouldn't work. When we then went to the RE, that was sort of a big learning point for us because they did some retesting of Olivia's hormone levels and identified that her AMH was slightly low for her age. And so what we kind of found out was the OB was looking at a general range for what is normal for AMH, which is a hormone that indicates ovarian reserve without getting too much into, all the ins and outs. But that was, I think, an eye-opening moment for us of why it's so important to advocate and really educate ourselves, because that helped us feel like we had some more information about what was going on. But it was only by going to the specialist and the reproductive endocrinologist that we actually found that out. We would have sort of gone on thinking that everything was normal and we just have to keep on trying. So it was really helpful to learn that. It was also very hard on Olivia to hear that because, in finding out those diagnoses, one or both of you is going to find out like there's something about you that's contributing to this maybe. And that's really hard to hear.
Did you feel any relief that it wasn't you?
I honestly, not really. It was harder for me to see Olivia hearing that news. I almost wish that it was me. So I was like, I would rather have this on me because that news was really hard on Olivia. I just remember being in that appointment where we were debriefing the results with the RE. And as Olivia describes it, and I kind of write it in my book, like when the RE gave us that news, Olivia just kind of like shut down. And I could see in her eyes looking at her, I could just see like her eyes were like stunned and blank. And I was like, okay, my kind of adrenaline kicked in. And I was like, all right, I've got to like listen here because I can tell Olivia's just really stunned and really,
emotionally flooded maybe.
Yeah. And so, yeah, honestly, I was kind of like, I wish it was me because it was so hard to see how hard that was for Olivia to hear.
Okay. Well, so your journey has taken a lot of turns and has had a lot of pivot points and decision moments. Was this one of those big moments where you had to decide what we want to do next? Or was it just obvious to both of you dive in, do fertility treatments?
It was a big pivot moment because we definitely did not expect the RE's recommendation, which was to go right to IVF. We thought, maybe we'll try some IUIs or some lower interventions, but, their assessment was, I want to do what gives you the best shot. We were also fortunate to have insurance coverage that would allow us to do that. But yeah, we basically got that recommendation. They gave us a couple of minutes kind of in a consult room to just prepare. And we basically just looked at each other and we're like, I guess we're doing IVF. But that, of course, was as a result of so many conversations we'd already had, and kind of debriefing like, hey, I listened to this podcast today. Have you heard, about this treatment? Or, we had so many of those conversations between me and Olivia of just kind of sharing what we were finding out, sharing different stories we had heard from people who had put them on podcasts and blogs. And that was helpful just to get an idea of what might be in store for us.
So it sounds to me like, would it be fair to say that you guys were both not only educated consumers of fertility as a process and also were already on the same page because you had so many conversations?
Yeah, we were definitely on the same page. And I certainly in situations like that, always did as much as I could to kind of defer to Olivia and get a sense of how she's feeling, because going through IVF was going to be much more of a physical toll on her. But we had so many of those conversations in advance. So I definitely don't want to make it sound as if we were just sort of magically on the same page. It wasn't that. It was from a lot of conversation in advance. And that's sort of just I think the nature of our conversations and how Olivia and I relate to each other. And so this was definitely an instance where, because of having those conversations, we were able to say like, IVF, let's go.
Cool. You and I have previously had some conversations or have discussed that you and Olivia are great at asking each other questions and diving into some of the more complicated emotional stuff that one can feel in going through a process like this. What were some of the big conversations you had, either at this moment or along the way? And can you tell us a little bit about how you framed them, how you brought them up to one another? Because I think it's important. I didn't have to address anyone else's emotions but my own in my journey. And when you're in a couple, when you're in a partnership, whether you're gay, straight, whatever, you have to think not only about yourself and where you are in your journey, but you also have to take into account your partner. Help me understand how you navigate that.
Yeah, definitely. I think the first big kind of conversation or like ongoing conversation we had in those first couple of weeks when we were just kind of figuring out that something was not kind of working with our attempts to conceive were just a lot of conversations around coming to terms with it, accepting it, grieving it, just in terms of our expectations of how we thought family building was going to go. And it definitely pushed us to have conversations around, first, why did we want to build our family to begin with? And I think that's a really important conversation for any person to have with themselves, and certainly any couple to have with each other, because that helped us, I think, always have kind of like a mission statement, for lack of a better term, to kind of go back to it. Like, we want to build our family because we value the idea of having children in our lives, of being able to share a life with them, and both just get a lot of joy from kids and the idea of being able to share the things that we love with them. And so I think that gave us a good grounding of why we were going through all the difficulty. It really helped us in the difficult moments as we got into really hard things that came along in our journey.
I'm going to interrupt this line of questioning just because I just want to like underscore and highlight this. You have a team mission statement, you and Olivia. And you just shared it with us, that kids bring joy and that you want to have a life that you share with kids. That's just mind blowing. I mean, there's a lot of great research around pivoting organizations around a mission statement or purpose statement. Most recently, Simon Sinek has gotten really famous with finding your why when you're personally looking for a job. But I've never heard it apply to a couple and in terms of family building. So I think that's really, really special.
Yeah. And I don't think we ever necessarily called it that, but it definitely served in that same way. Right. It gave us something like a bedrock that we were able to always come back to. And I think that I'm glad that we didn't sort of skip over that process, because we of course had talked many times about having kids. We talked on our third date about having kids. So we knew for a long time that was something that we wanted in our future. But I think it was really important to us to kind of slow down and revisit that when we were heading into that difficult time, because
put it into words, right?
Yeah,
because
definitely.
Somebody just asked me yesterday, and they asked an open-ended question. I said, what's pulling you to do this? It was in reference to a desire I have to have a second kid. And they're like, what's the pull? What's driving that? Damned if I know. It's just like an emotional, deep sense of, I don't know, knowing, or it's just a pull. And I like that you were able to put it in words as that. You called it a touch space, or, something that grounds you in the process forward. I also think it's interesting that you didn't say biological kids. You said a life that has kids.
Yep.
You have this touchstone. You have this mission statement. You've put in words those feelings of this is something we want for our lives. And you begin an IVF journey. Tell us a little bit about what happens next.
Yeah. So we dove into the IVF process. Our first retrieval happened very, very soon thereafter. Everything from that conversation with the RE started moving very quickly. We had, I think, meds arriving to our doorstep about a week later. So we dove right in. And in the first retrieval, yielded some embryos that seemed to be viable and looked good. So we transferred one and found out on Halloween of 2018 that Olivia was pregnant first time. That unfortunately ended in miscarriage. We ended up in sort of a back and forth over the next 6 or 7 weeks where her HCG level was going up, but not quickly enough. And so we kind of ended up in what we called beta limbo or beta hell, where we were sort of waiting and looking at the HCG level, and it was going up a little bit, but not quite enough. And so we really had to wait for the ultrasound to diagnose what had happened. At the first ultrasound, there was essentially no development. It was a blighted ovum, which means there's basically a gestational sac with nothing in it. So that was our first loss. And that was kind of the end of that first cycle. We had some additional embryos frozen from it. So we then went back a few months later for another embryo transfer. Olivia got pregnant again, but unfortunately that one also ended in a miscarriage. And that one was really difficult. That was a missed miscarriage where we had graduated from our fertility clinic, had seen baby's heartbeat a couple of times, and then went in for our 12-week ultrasound, and there was no heartbeat. So that was, of course, one of the lowest moments in all of this. It was just a really devastating moment because it was really like the first time that we felt like maybe we're going to have some hope and maybe this journey is progressing toward a resolution. And it was just a really devastating moment. And so that was definitely a point where we stepped back and had to have some more conversations about just where are we going with this. Of course, went back to like, what's our purpose here? But that was a big shift moment.
Tell us about the conversations you had at that time.
Yeah, so we decided to, for a few reasons. One, just because Olivia's body had been through a lot. We said, let's give ourselves a few months here to just like not do any treatments, not be pumping you full of hormones. Let's do some travel. Let's do some other things. And so because we had that time, one of the big conversations we also definitely had during those months was how does like biology play into this and what other family building options might work for us? So I remember, on the night that Olivia had that miscarriage, we had to go into the doctor and we had to go into the hospital for a ENC operation. And after that operation, I remember looking at Olivia, we were both just kind of shell-shocked and devastated. And I think she said to me, we need to look at adoption. We need to meet with adoption groups and just understand how that might work for us. And so, we obviously took a few days after that to kind of just like, lick our wounds and grieve. But I did find a really wonderful adoption group here in our area and just reached out to them and said, hey, we'd love to meet with somebody, talk with somebody, just kind of learn about the process. And that kind of kicked us into some really good conversations between me and Olivia of what are we open to and sort of what are our boundaries around the different options we might pursue. Because of course, at that point, it was like everything was open. We're concerned to say like, we're not sure if IVF is going to work for us. We've had 2 transfers, 2 losses. That's not a great track record, but it was good because it really pushed us to think, what does it mean to us to be a family? And so we had that meeting with some folks from the adoption group, and they came with their 2 kids who were adopted. And I think just having the conversation, being in that space, seeing those kids, I think also helped us to both recognize that in some ways in our lives, we had already developed relationships with kids we had no biological relation to. Certainly me as an educator, I have those kids I still think about from classes I taught in 3rd grade 10, 12 years ago, who I'm not, of course, related to, but like I think of them in this kind of parental way of like, I just want the best for them. And so I think that pushed us to have conversations around, what about donor eggs? What about donor sperm? What about donor embryos? What about adoption, fostering? And what it helped us kind of get to over time was that we really get to, we get to choose what family means for us. And we felt definitely that we would both be open and both be entirely comfortable with adoption as a route, donor egg. We kind of said that the most important thing for us is to have kids. It's not to be pregnant.
It's such an important moment of self-reflection, right? Because at any point in our paths, we have to make these pivots. We have to turn left. We have to turn right. We have to decide to double down on the path we're going forward in. It's not an easy thing to come to those conclusions individually or as a couple. Did you find that you guys were always on the same page, or were there moments where you sort of had to articulate, here's my perspective and here's how I'm seeing it and what's your perspective, and sort of come to alignment that way?
Yeah, we definitely, we got there. And again, it was through a lot of conversation. I don't think we had any moments where it was necessarily like I was strongly for one thing and Olivia was strongly for another. But I think it was more after that kind of initial meeting with the adoption group, we both, I think, just had some time to reflect and we just sort of drove home from it. And it wasn't like a definite conversation of like, yes, but we kind of had a moment driving home from it of just being like, this feels like something that is definitely a totally viable option for us. Mm-hmm. We know that we would both need to like do some more making sense of what it means for us. But yeah, just felt like this is something we could do. And then as we got into other discussions about, what if potentially we needed donor eggs or donor sperm or donor embryos, it brought up the same types of conversations and pushed us, I think, also to, again, kind of go with that education thing and look for more stories and understand more about that. So yeah, it was really helpful.
First of all, I am a huge fan of storytelling as a mechanism to understand what works for you and what doesn't work for you, which is one of the reasons this podcast exists. But also, in my experience, when I've had to make big decisions, one of the things that I do is I like to play with the margins of like, let me imagine the craziest scenario. What does that look like? And let me think about the thing that I would be absolutely fundamentally opposed to. And like, where are my boundaries? And so you're sort of pushing against what works and what doesn't work for you until you can kind of narrow into the thing that might work. Did you guys have any definitive, not this?
I think the only place we sort of drew a line was fostering, only because as we learn more about it, we really learned the purpose of fostering, which is not necessarily to lead to a permanent placement for kids. And I think that's an important thing. Although, of course, there are many instances and people we know who have fostered and led to a legal adoption. I think that for us, we knew emotionally, I think we both really love children and really connect with children. And I think that as hard as it would be, I think we just said it would be too emotionally hard for us to be in a position where we fostered a child. They potentially lived with us for months, years, and then to know that that could come to an end. I think we just knew that that would be too hard emotionally for us. And of course, there's a whole host of emotionally hard things about any other path, but that was definitely one boundary we both kind of agreed on. Definitely talk quite a bit of these types of conversations too around donor sperm and donor eggs, and thinking like, if we were to do donor eggs, how would that make Olivia feel? And sort of feeling like there's not that genetic connection to her, though the plan was still to hopefully have her carry a child, even if it were donor eggs. And we'd end up having to go that route. But she was very comfortable with it. And in some ways, it was harder for me, more because I was just guarding against Olivia's feelings. I didn't have any concern, but I remember a couple of times saying like, what if we just did donor embryos? So that way it's kind of like an equal playing field versus, having like my sperm in a donor egg and then Olivia carrying it. And it was funny. She was like, no, I'm fine with this. And so it was funny because I was in some ways like maybe guarding more against what I thought that Olivia would feel about it versus the reality.
Is it because you're putting yourself in her shoes and feeling like if it were reversed and you use donor sperm, you'd be missing out in some way?
Maybe. Yeah, maybe. And I always kind of said like, if we had to use donor sperm, that would be cool with me. I think I was probably maybe just assuming too much of like how Olivia would feel. Cause she was definitely, would say multiple times, like, I'm okay with donor eggs if we have to go there. Like, I'm okay with it.
Yeah.
So I was, maybe like getting too extreme into my empathy and not just like listening to what she was saying and being like, yeah, this is cool. And we're okay with this option.
There's two things too that come to mind when I think about using donor sperm or donor eggs when in a heterosexual couple. And the one is that when you fall in love with somebody, you kind of hope to have a piece of them. You're like, I love you. I want more of you. But the other is a sense of fairness. Like, it's unfair that I get my DNA and you don't get yours. Was that playing out at all for you guys?
Yeah, I think it definitely was.
Well, I want to keep progressing down your journey. But before I do, I want to recognize that we're talking a lot about the head stuff, doing the research, educating others, getting educated yourself, and having the heady conversations.
Mhm.
But there's some heart stuff here too. 2 losses, a lot of pivoting. How are you guys nurturing one another and making sure that you guys were okay?
Yeah, that was a big piece of it too. I think I certainly learned a lot about what it meant to take care of myself. And my biggest learning, I would say, was just that it was important to give myself space to do kind of self-care and grieving, because I kind of was quick to jump into a take care of Olivia mode, or like, what can I do for her? What can I do for us? And I think Olivia is kind of more naturally like in tune, or was more naturally in tune with her own needs and making sure that she had space to grieve, which of course was really hard at all of these points. But I think certainly after the second miscarriage, I really had to be a lot more intentional about also giving myself time and space to kind of process things, because I found I was almost risking like getting burnt out because I was spending too much time thinking about like, am I taking care of Olivia enough? Are we getting what we need? Am I setting up for whatever comes next? And so at that point, really got more into like meditation, which is something I've practiced in the past, but really found that to be helpful. Started to do some writing, which I think was helpful too, just to kind of like get those thoughts and anxious worries out there. And then we also definitely had to just talk a lot about what does feel supportive for each other and what we need, because I think I probably brought some assumptions around like, what does Olivia need and what would be supportive to her? And so it was important for us to step back and kind of discuss like, what do you need? Do you just need space? Do you want just like time to yourself? Do you want to talk about this? Do you not want to talk about this right now? Because there was definitely a lot of that over the whole journey. Yeah.
You just said 2 really, really important things. One is, it's not the first time I've heard a guy going through this and a heterosexual couple saying, I was taking on so much of the emotional caregiving, I forgot about myself.
Mm-hmm.
So for any listeners out here who may be feeling that in any type of partnership, I think your discussion about self-care is so critical. It's so important. And then talking about what self-care looks like or what you need is also key. It goes back to the love languages. Like, I don't need gifts right now. I need food or, whatever. Yeah. So let's go back to your journey. At the last conversation, we were talking about 2 losses. We're talking about some deep conversations. You do the research and education around adoption and fostering, and you start to explore donor eggs and donor sperm. Catch us up. Where does it go from here?
Yeah. So after a few months of kind of having those conversations, taking some time away, doing some travel, we met back with our RE, who at that point, and we were pretty direct with the RE at that point, that we were feeling pretty run down by the process. And we're, of course, like ready to jump back in, but also we're starting to sort of feel like we were coming up against that limit of like, how many retrievals can we do? How many transfers can we do and not find success? Which of course looks really different for everybody, but we were very direct about that. And so I don't know if that affected things, but it definitely felt like RE was very intentional and proactive after that conversation, which again, maybe was due to that kind of advocating for ourselves and being very upfront about where we saw us coming up against our boundaries. But that kind of spurred a couple of things. The first was that the RE did a recurrent loss blood panel on Olivia to see if anything would show up there. And it did actually reveal a potential blood clotting factor, which was really good to know. It was hard to tell whether it really had any effect, but it led the RE to recommend adding Lovenox in any future cycles. So that was good. And then the other thing the RE recommended was to do genetic testing on our embryos. And so that was kind of our game plan. And I think that was helpful because it made us feel like we were doing something different and that we had kind of learned more and were giving hopefully a better shot to ourselves. Because I think that was something that was really just psychologically helpful, was like, we'd hit that point where we're like, we can't just keep doing the same thing. We need to feel like there's something more proactive here. And so did another egg retrieval, got a few more embryos out of that, and then defrosted some of the previous ones and sent out those embryos from second retrieval for genetic testing. And we got back that there were 2 normal embryos. So we transferred one of those on October 30th of 2019, and that resulted in the birth of our daughter, Eliza, in July 2020.
I'm hearing a lot of Halloween good luck. Right?
I know.
There was the first one happened around that time, the first loss, and then now the first success.
Yeah. It definitely feels like there's some sort of October cosmic thing for me and Olivia. Our first date was in October. Our wedding was in October. Our first egg retrieval was in October. And now the big thing is our second daughter is due in a couple of weeks in October 2022. So there's definitely some sort of, our dog was born in October. Yeah, there's some sort of kismet there for sure.
Well, congratulations. It sounds like a lot of this rumination and conversation and exploration has led to a family that, well, does it look the way you wanted it to look?
It does. And it's strange to be able to kind of get to that point where we can say that. It looked the way we envisioned it, but I think we also very much got to the point, after Eliza was born, we very much got to the point where we said, if Eliza is our only child, then we can get to a space where we're okay with that. We certainly pictured 2, maybe 3. This upcoming baby will definitely be our last. We're like, 2 is good and we're happy. But I think it gave us the space to say like, yes, we're really fortunate and really happy. And then the family that we have been able to build definitely looks like what we envisioned. But I think even now, as I look back, we got ourselves into a space where we said, we don't know the exact answer. If that's one child that we end up bringing into our family through adoption, that's okay. If it's 2 children who come to us via IVF, that's okay too. And so we kind of got to that space of openness.
And that's where having that mission statement, that touch point is so critical, because if your mission statement looked different, if it were, it's really important to me to have biological children, well then, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's a wonderful mission statement. If the mission statement is, I want to have a life filled with joy, and my joy can be found traveling and pursuing career opportunities that light my heart on fire and may or may not include kids, to some extent, having the mission statement to guide you means that when you achieve whatever it is you achieve, you can look back and say, aha, this matches the mission statement.
Totally. And like you're saying, that mission statement might change over time. We've talked about sort of the answers that we came to. They're not going to be the same answers for everybody, and that's okay. I think we definitely kind of added little bits to our mission statement over time. I think as we were just talking about, the difference of when we set out, certainly had more of a mindset of we want to have children. Logically, we want Olivia to be pregnant and experience pregnancy, but definitely got to a point where maybe we pared back our mission statement to just, we want to add kids to our family for the joy it's going to bring, hopefully, to all of us, whatever that takes.
So I want to go back to you being an educator, because you've written a book. I mean, you've taken your experiences and you've created a tool that can help so many people. Yeah. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the book and the generation of it?
Yeah, I would love to. Yeah, I published my first book, The IVF Dad, in July 2022. And it really started with just doing some writing after Eliza was about a year old, and we were about to go back into sort of going for another embryo transfer in hopes of having a second child. And I really just started writing and almost kind of recording the story of what we went through, mostly just for myself at the beginning, of just thinking we've had this really intense journey and it just feels like I need to record this in some way and kind of like get it all out of my head. Yeah. Whether that's, for me, for Olivia, which I definitely shared all of it as I was writing with. And then, eventually maybe hopefully if our kids are interested in reading it too. And so as I wrote more and more, became a lot longer than I thought, kind of really quickly. And I think simultaneously, you had mentioned earlier, like what were the resources I had at the beginning of our journey. And one resource I tapped into a little bit, but would have tapped into more maybe now just because it's more developed, because it's more available, is sort of the really big social media community around infertility. And so having kind of seen that and understood all of what's out there, as I started to write and record our story, it was really helpful for me. But I think Olivia maybe first said, this is something that maybe could be useful to people if we share it. And so that kind of led me to really think about, what does that look like? And what am I trying to do here? Am I trying to write something that I try to shop around as like an article for a newspaper or a magazine, or am I just going to start a blog or a YouTube channel, or like, what am I going to do? And I think it really was kind of my deep down like educator passion that made me think I can write a book that does a couple of things that I think would be really helpful and that would provide a male perspective that I did not find was super easy to find out there when I was in earlier stages of my journey.
I agree with that.
And so, yeah, as the story came together, I knew that I wanted that to be kind of the anchor that goes through the book. So every chapter in the book and kind of interspersed throughout really walks you through our journey, because our journey really follows the path of family building and fertility treatment from the start to kind of grappling with understanding that something was not working to diagnoses and treatment and so forth. So the story kind of carries everything. But then as I continued to write, I knew that I wanted to include some easy to understand information about just the fertility treatment process, what the different diagnoses are to what the different treatments are, and not in super depth. Like folks can go out there obviously and find a number of great doctors and other health providers who are sharing like more in-depth information. But I wanted to tap into that educator side and say, let me explain this in like plain English that anybody can make sense of. And so that's sort of a second piece, is just a lot of information about fertility treatment and adoption and other options for family building. And then the third piece that kind of emerged over time was, like you said, the sort of heart work piece of what are the things and emotions that you might feel over time, and how do you use those to support yourself, but also to support your partner. And so there's some parts that are kind of dedicated just toward helping men, because I think men, of course, deal with that stereotype where we're really not supposed to share our feelings. So I think just having a book that kind of explains that is helpful. But yeah, I wanted to bring together those three pieces. And yeah, I've been really proud with how it turned out.
I'm so impressed with the multi-layers that you're able to weave together, from your story to the technical stuff, to the questions, to the heart work. It's such an incredible resource. I own it and love it, even though it's totally irrelevant to me as a solo mom without a male partner. But I'm curious, now that it's out there in the world, what are some of the questions you're getting from readers? Are you seeing any trends or themes around either questions or reactions to elements of the book?
Yeah, well, the reactions have been really wonderful, and they've been so gratifying, I think, just to feel in some way that we've been able to turn our difficult experience into something that's helping others. I've been surprised and give Olivia a lot of credit. She always said in the beginning, like, I know you're writing this book that is from the male perspective for men, but she said, I really think this is going to be something that women, couples, men can kind of use together to spark conversations. And so I've been really surprised and just really pleased to hear from so many folks who have said, we're a couple and we're reading your book together and helping it to kind of guide conversations that we can have to stay connected, to support each other better through this process. So that's been really wonderful. And it's definitely definitely forced us to rethink, just that balance and what we wanted in every way. Olivia now stays home and takes care of Eliza full time. So that was definitely another thing that kind of came up for us, but that, of course, is something that we discussed for a long time. It was something that Olivia felt was kind of part of her journey and something she wanted to do. So that helped us. But yeah, it's also interesting. And I loved the conversation you'd have with Jordana Keir, just her discussion of how being a parent and how building your family does force you to do that constant reevaluation of like, are things in balance? Where are things not in balance? What does that look like? So yeah, it's all super interesting.
Totally. Well, to follow-up question, you have answered this one throughout the entire conversation, so it's a little unfair to throw it at you, but I'm curious how you define family, the word family.
Yeah, it's definitely like a central thread through all the conversations we've had. I think like the best that I can kind of explain is something that I wrote in the book, which is that love makes a family, not genetics. That's kind of simple but elegant, but like I think shows up in so many ways. And I feel this way too about not just about our family building, but about people who are our friends, who we do love, and who, we have so many friends who are not genetically related to us, but our kids know them as uncle or auntie or whatever like that. And I think it's so powerful for anyone to just realize that family is truly about the people you love, the people who support you, the people who give you joy, genetics secondary to that. There's so many people in everybody's life who don't share genetics, but who give you joy and who support you. And what's more family than that, right?
And hearing you say that, I'm thinking about that vision exercise that you and Olivia did around who are the kids in our lives that we feel that parental love for. And they're not necessarily kids that we are currently parenting. And so that's, yeah. So Keegan, this book is amazing. I can't rave about it enough. Your book is really tremendous. How can we find it? How can we find you? If we have questions.
Yeah. So you can find me on Instagram at the IVF Dad. You can also find me on my website, www.theivfdad.com. And my book, The IVF Dad, is available on Amazon worldwide. So would love to hear from folks who've read it. And the last thing I always want to make sure I mention about the book is a third of the proceeds from the book go to the Stork'd Foundation, which is a big sort of piece of the mission of writing it that emerged over time. Was I really wanted to not just write the book as a resource, but find another way to hopefully have it impact and help other people. So yeah, the Stork'd Foundation makes grants to support couples in affording fertility treatments, which we know can be such an additional stressor during an already very stressful time. So it's a really important thing that's near and dear to my heart too.
I love that, because we have talked around the margin about having access to things like insurance that covers IVF, a home that you feel safe in, some of those things that enable this family building journey. And not all of us have access to that. So that's so kind of you to make sure that you're using your book to not only educate others, but enable others.
Yeah, it's just an honor to be able to do that. The biggest reward of having written it is just the amazing notes from people who it's helping. It feels like it's giving purpose to a lot of pain that we went through. And that's really just a wonderful feeling.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you so much for chatting with us today. More to come for sure. I have a feeling there'll be other books and resources, and we'll do another episode down the road. But thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This is great.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to Stork'd with your host, Julia Carroll. This podcast is changing the conversation around the ways people define and create family. If you like what you hear, please support us by sharing with friends and following on Instagram at Stork'd_podcast. We also always appreciate it when you rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For more information, visit storkedpodcast.com to sign up for our newsletter. That's STORKD podcast.com.